In the ruins of a Roman town destroyed by Mount Vesuvius nearly 2,000 years ago, archaeologists made a startling find. A human brain turned to glass. It sounds like something out of a science fiction, a person's brain vitrified into a glass-like substance. Yet, it's exactly what researchers found inside the skull of one of Vesuvius' victims. This phenomenon of glassy soft tissue had never been observed in nature before. How could an ancient volcanic eruption transform a living brain tissue into glass? This mystery has puzzled scientists for years and led to a deep investigation. In this video, we'll explore how the fiery eruption of 79 CE flash glassified a man's brain, what conditions made this incredibly rare preservation possible, and what it reveals about the catastrophe that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. Mount Vesuvius' eruption in 79 CE is infamous for obliterating the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Herculaneum, a seaside town a few miles from Pompeii, was hit by an especially intense heat. Unlike Pompeii, where many victims were entombed in ash, leaving hollows later filled with plaster, at Herculaneum the heat was so extreme that it instantly killed residents and even vaporized soft tissues. The town was engulfed by pyroclastic flows, fast-moving surges of hot gas, ash, and rock traveling close to the ground. These flows can reach hundreds of degrees in temperature and move at hurricane speeds, incinerating nearly everything in their path. Amid this hellish environment, one victim's remains have stood out. Herculaneum's Collegium Augustaleum, a civic building dedicated to the imperial cult. Archaeologists in the 1960s uncovered the skeleton of a young man who had died lying on a wooden bed. He is thought to have been the custodian, aka the caretaker of the building, about 20 years old. His bones were charred by the heat, but inside his skull, researchers found something extraordinary. Shiny black glass-like fragments where his brain and spinal cord once were. At first, these mysterious glassy bits baffled archaeologists. Could a human brain really transform into glass during a volcanic eruption? The discovery sparked intense debate in the scientific community about whether the material was truly vitrified brain tissue and, if so, how such a transformation could have happened. When this glassy brain was first reported, it created a scientific mystery. Glass forms when a liquid cools and solidifies so quickly that crystals don't have time to form, yielding an amorphous solid. We see natural glass in things like volcanic obsidian and in fulgurites. Glassy tubes form when lightning strikes sand, but finding glass made from biological tissue was unheard of. Normally, extreme heat would simply burn up or vaporize soft tissue, leaving ash or nothing at all. So how could a brain be liquefied and then solidified into glass instead of being completely destroyed? Scientists call this process vitrification, the conversion of a substance into glass. Vitrification requires two key conditions: a very high heat to turn material into liquid, and rapid cooling to freeze that liquid into a glassy solid before it crystallizes. In essence, the brain would have had to be flash fried and then flash frozen in terms of temperature in a matter of seconds. It's a delicate balance. Too much heat for too long and the brain would have been obliterated. Cooling too slowly and you'd get solid char or crystals, not glass. It's not the heating that transforms things into glass. In order to make glass, you need a fast cooling. So, was such a drastic heat and quench scenario even possible during Vesuvius' eruption? Initial skeptics argued it was incredibly unlikely for soft tissue to vitrify under natural conditions. The known pyroclastic flows at Herculaneum were certainly lethal, but based on prior studies, they likely reached maximum temperatures of around 565 degrees Celsius or 869 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to kill and char bodies, but not hot enough to melt the brain and turn it into glass and cool it rapidly. Moreover, pyroclastic material would have stayed hot for a relatively long duration as it buried the town, not exactly a quick quench. For the brain to vitrify, something even more extreme and fleeting had to be at play. The breakthrough came when researchers re-examined the context of the victim's death and performed new tests on the glassy brain fragments. In 2020, an initial study confirmed that the shiny black material in the skull was indeed preserved brain tissue. They detected structures resembling neurons and axons, nerve cell fibers, and identified proteins typically found in the human brain. This was the first confirmation that we really had a glass brain on our hands, and not just some coincidental mineral deposit. But the question remained, what chain of events during the eruption could create the right conditions for the vitrification? To answer this, scientists turned to both laboratory analysis and clues from the archaeological site. They use a technique called differential scanning calorimetry on the brain glass samples, essentially heating the ancient glass fragments in a controlled way to see how they behave. The glassy shards underwent structural changes at around 510 degrees Celsius or 950 degrees Fahrenheit, indicating that the brain tissue likely reached at least that temperature when it originally liquefied and vitrified. In other words, about 510 degrees Celsius was the magic number to turn this brain to glass. That's significantly hotter than the estimated temperatures of the pyroclastic flow that buried Herculaneum, which suggests something even hotter hit the victim first. The researchers hypothesized that just before the main pyroclastic flow engulfed the town, the area was blasted by a superheated ash cloud, a sort of initial shock wave of hot ash and gas at much higher temperature. This type of phenomenon is sometimes called a pyroclastic surge or ash cloud surge. It's a more dilute, billowing cloud of fine ash that can race ahead of the denser pyroclastic flow and, crucially, be even hotter but shorter-lived. At Herculaneum, evidence suggests a searing ash cloud swept through just moments before everything was buried. According to the latest study, this ash cloud may have exceeded 950 degrees Fahrenheit or 510 degrees Celsius, hot enough to flash heat the brain to a boiling liquid state. Because the cloud was fast-moving and short in duration, it would have dissipated quickly, causing a sudden temperature drop after the initial blast. Imagine the scenario. In an instant, a wave of gas and ash hotter than a blast furnace surged through the room where the young man lay. The heat was so intense that the fatty and wet brain tissue nearly boiled inside his skull, turning into a semi-liquid state. The victim certainly died instantly from this heat shock. Essentially, he was flash-fried by the volcano surge. But then, within minutes or even seconds, that superhot cloud passed by or lifted. Immediately afterward, the now liquefied brain was buried by slightly cooler ash and debris from the main eruption flow, which caused it to cool rapidly in the enclosed space of the skull. The result? The brain tissue cooled so fast that it solidified into an amorphous glass-like form instead of burning away or crystallizing. In effect, the volcano created conditions of an ancient glass-making kiln, but with human brain matter as the molten glass. One might wonder, why didn't the brain completely vaporize or shatter? The researchers believed the skull and perhaps even the surrounding ash and collapsed building provided just enough insulation and structure to protect the brain tissue from being entirely blown away while still allowing the extreme heating. Essentially, the skull acted like a container that let the brain cook but not disperse. By the time the liquefied brain could leak out or be destroyed, the rapid cooling had frozen it in place as a glass. It's a case of incredibly precise timing. The organic tissue had to be heated very quickly to avoid total combustion, and then cooled even quicker to prevent crystallization. If the timing or temperature had been slightly different, the brain would have been reduced to ash or conventional charred remains like all others. The fact that this young man's brain did vitrify means the conditions must have been uniquely ideal in that horrific moment. To support this explanation, scientists looked for physical evidence in Herculaneum's ruins that such a super-hot, short-lived ash blast occurred. They found it in the form of charcoal fragments near the victim's remains. Wood charcoal can record thermal events in its microstructure. The team discovered that these charged wood bits had experienced multiple heating events, and the earliest event showed the highest temperature, consistent with a sudden, extremely hot flash heating event. In an early interview, lead researcher Guido Giordano noted that the highest temperature burn marks on the charcoal are attributed to the early superhot ash cloud that hit Herculaneum just before the main flow. This aligns perfectly with the idea that an initial surge delivered the 510 degrees Celsius blast needed to vitrify the brain. What's more, modern volcanology has observed similar phenomena in recent history. For example, eruptions like Mount Unsen in 1991 in Japan and Mount Vesuvius in 2018 in Guatemala produced pyroclastic flows with associated ash surges. These ash clouds, though less dense, can be lethally hot and very fast. The Herculaneum evidence suggests that Vesuvius eruption had a comparable dynamic, an initial scorching wave that was brief. This explains a long-standing puzzle. Earlier estimates of pyroclastic flow temperature weren't high enough to vitrify a brain, and those flows lasted too long for quick cooling. The ash cloud theory elegantly solves that puzzle by introducing a short hot pulse followed by a rapid cooling as the cloud dissipates. Laboratory analysis of the vitrified brain pieces has provided further confirmation. Microscopic examination revealed intact neuronal structures. Essentially, the shapes of brain cells and their delicate tendrils were preserved in the glass. In fact, researchers identified preserved neurons and axons, the long fibers of nerve cells, within those glass shards. This is astonishing. It means that the internal microstructure of a first-century brain was snapshot in glass, like an ancient biological fossil. Those details could only survive if the conversion to glass was almost instantaneous, freezing the tissue before it had time to decompose or be destroyed. Chemical analysis also detected proteins that are common in brain tissue, further proving the glass fragments are of organic origin, the remains of the man's central nervous system. All of this lines up with the notion that we are indeed looking at a vitrified human brain, preserved by a freak set of volcanic circumstances. The glass brain of Herculaneum has not been without controversy. When the finding was first reported in 2020, it met with some skepticism in the scientific community. A few researchers questioned whether the glassy material was really the person's brain at all, or perhaps something else like tree resin or volcanic mineral that just happened to be in the skull. Others doubted that a human brain could undergo true vitrification under natural conditions, pointing out that the known temperature and cooling profiles of pyroclastic flows didn't match what would be needed. One forensic anthropologist, Alexandra Morton Hayward, argued that soft tissue vitrification in this context is incredibly unlikely and remained unconvinced the glass is of biological origin. She and some colleagues even noted that the samples of the material had not initially been widely shared for independent analysis, which fueled debate. However, the recent 2025 study led by Giordano and colleagues, published in Scientific Reports, has added significant weight to the argument that this is indeed a vitrified brain, and it offers a compelling mechanism for how it happened. The study's results, including the detection of brain cell structures and the charcoal evidence for a 510 degrees Celsius ash cloud, directly addressed the earlier doubts. While not everyone is fully convinced yet, many experts find the new explanation convincing. Volcanologist Benjamin Andrews, who was not involved in the research, called the findings remarkable, noting that a huge amount of information can be gleaned from these tiny glass fragments. The fact that this hypothesis is backed by both geological evidence, charcoal, and lab analysis of the glass itself makes a strong case. There are still questions to explore. For instance, why is this the only known example of a vitrified human brain? Given the very specific conditions required, very high heat followed by instant cooling, with the skull acting as a protective mold, it's likely an extremely rare fluke. Conditions must have been very, very specific, Giordano emphasizes. Most victims of Vesuvius and other volcanic eruptions didn't get their organs preserved this way. They were either burned to ash or decayed normally if buried in cooler ash. This Herculaneum custodian happened to be in just the wrong place at the wrong time to experience a flash of heat that was almost but not quite too much, followed by a rapid quench. It's sobering to think about, but also scientifically fascinating. The tale of the Pompeii Herculaneum glass brain is a vivid reminder of the sheer power and oddities of nature. In a fraction of a minute, a volcanic catastrophe cooked a man's brain and then froze it into glass, creating a macabre time capsule of human tissue. For the victim himself, of course, this event was unsurvivable. Fortunately, he would have felt nothing, as death was instantaneous in the 500 degrees Celsius ash blast. But nearly 2 millennia later, his unusual remains have given scientists an unprecedented window into the past. The vitrified brain fragments let researchers study the microstructure of an ancient Roman's nervous system, something no one ever imagined possible. Beyond the human history, this discovery teaches us about the dynamics of pyroclastic eruptions. It highlights how eruptions have complex phases, including superhot surges that can do things we wouldn't ordinarily predict, like making human glass. The fact that Mount Vesuvius could turn a brain to glass underscores the extreme conditions during the disaster and helps volcanologists refine their understanding of pyroclastic phenomena.